Handling messaging exceptions. If we don't define our own exception strategy, MMUULLEE's default exception strategy will be used. The default exception strategy is implicitly and globally handling all message exceptions thrown in the application. This will by default stop the execution of the flow and log the exception. We cannot configure the true default exception strategy, but we can replace that exception strategy with our own global default if preferred. We'll see this later in the module. For handling message exceptions, when a message is processed through a MMUULLEE flow and throws an exception, that execution is going to stop and the message will be passed to the first processor in the exception strategy, assuming one exists. Exception strategies are added to the error handling section of the flow. That's what you see in the bottom of this flow. Each flow can contain only one exception strategy, but if you do need more advanced logic, like the ability to handle certain types of exceptions specifically, you can add a choice exception strategy in the bottom that can then contain multiple exception strategies. Each exception strategy can contain any number of message processors and even call out to subflows and flows as needed. Inside an exception strategy, you can reference the exception object. Think of this like another context. As you can see in this logger, using the MMUULLEE expression language, we can call exception. Then we have multiple methods that we can get different information. So if we need to evaluate the summary message, a verbose message, the message code, a detailed message about the exception, all of these are available to us. And I encourage you, if you're checking out this context, to check out the documentation and just to throw them in a logger to see what they print out and how it varies between these different methods. Now for status codes. By default, when a message is handled, if you have an HTTP-based app, a status code of 200 will be set and returned. Now this can be changed really a couple ways. One is that you could set an outbound property of http.status, and the HTTP listener that will send the response back will respect whatever you set in that field. Often when you're writing APIs, you can also use a mapping exception strategy. And this is something that we looked at earlier when we saw API Kit. This will allow us to globally define a bunch of exception handlers that have their own status code linked to them. So let's get into our first walkthrough, 8.1, handling a messaging exception. We'll add a catch exception strategy to a flow. We'll catch the exception and add the set payload to send an error message back to the client. We'll reference an exception object inside of our exception handler, and we'll set an HTTP status code inside of that exception handler. Let's get started. Let's return to Anypoint Studio and find the Get Delta Flights flow. In the Get Delta Flights flow, let's make sure that there's a breakpoint on our flow reference component. In this case, I've got one, so I can toggle on and off, effectively just making sure we have a breakpoint already there. We'll then start off by debugging the project. So we'll right-click and debug project. And once this starts up, we'll get ready to send ourselves to Postman so that we can do a little bit of testing around the started application. All right. So now that it has been deployed successfully, let's head over to Postman. And from Postman, we are going to make a request to localhost 8081/delta with a code of foo. And we'll send the request in. Once you've sent the request in, you should see that the message stops at the breakpoint. And once this message has stopped at the breakpoint, we can move ourselves through. So using the MMUULLEE debugger, we'll step over the transform message component. We'll go through our flow ref rather, and then through the transform message component. And then once on top of the web service consumer, if we step again, we'll go to our next transform message, and then stepping, we'll get an error. Now this error is what we're going to be focusing on. If you expand it down inside of here, you can see that there is some type of payload inside of here and an exception thrown, specifically an exception around some of the data weave pieces. So clearly when we're getting this error type of payload back where there's not this destination, we are throwing an exception and that's blowing up inside of our application. For now, let's click the resume button. We'll head back to Postman for just a moment and we can see the whole kind of exception is being printed back to our client, which is certainly less than ideal in this type of situation. So back inside of Anypoint Studio, if we flip to the Mule design perspective, let's search for the catch exception strategy. In fact, what even could be a bit more helpful for your first glance here is if we go into this error handling section, you can take a quick look at all the different error handling strategies there are. Now we're going to start with one of the very common ones, which is, again, catch exception strategy. What we'll do is expand the error handling box in the bottom, and then let's drag the catch exception strategy into this flow. Now you'll see a new scope at the bottom for catch exception strategy. Let's put a set payload transformer inside of here. We'll double click on the set payload, making sure it's selected. And let's set our payload to a more desirable message. So inside of here, we'll actually just start off with the code itself. So we can keep this bracket as is for now and type in no flights to. And then inside of the expression here, we can say flow vars dot and print out our code, because effectively this is all happening because there's no flights to this destination. Now inside of here, we can additionally say that we want to put in a break. So to do a break, we will concatenate a string literal that's a \n, which represents a return, and then plus, and in this case, we can use our exception. So this will print out flowvars.code and then some information about the exception object itself. Okay. Now with this in place, let's also put a logger after the set payload so it's a little bit easier for us to read. And let's also put a breakpoint on the set payload transformer itself. Okay. Now that we've got a basic exception strategy in place, we'll save our application, which should in effect cause it to redeploy. Once we've redeployed successfully, let's again make sure we have a breakpoint on the set payload so we can move through the exception strategy. And we'll head back to Postman and send another request in. Now, once you've sent that request in through Postman, let's step forward so that with our green arrow here, we can move all the way up to the exception. Then let's step forward again so that we move into our catch exception strategy. So now we can see right after that exception is thrown, it is caught in this catch exception strategy. If we move forward, we can see that the payload is changed. It says no flights to foo. And we can also see after that the break along with the details about the exception itself. And now let's step forward again. Back inside of Postman, we can see a slightly varied message saying no flights to foo, and we also print out that data. Now this is an example of a basic exception that has been caught and sent back, but one other problem we have is we're still getting a 200 OK set back to us. So with a lot of our APIs, let's go ahead and change this up. If we go into our setup here, so if we go back to Anypoint Studio, let's say that we want to call this a bad request because foo is not a valid parameter. So inside of here, we need to give it a 400 status code. We'll go back to our design palette, and from here, we will put in a property transformer, drag that right between the set payload and the logger you currently have. And we can use set property here to set a name and a value. Now again, there's sort of this reserved key called http.status that the Mule HTTP listener is going to respect when it responds back to the client. For value, let's go ahead and put in the value of 400. All right. Now that we've got HTTP status 400, let's save once again. And this time, we'll go ahead and make another request through. So we'll go back to Postman, hit send, back to Anypoint Studio and switch perspectives as needed. And we'll step through once again using our green arrow. So we'll move over to the exception. We'll move down into the exception strategy. And then using our curled stepper here to go to the next processor, we'll move over to the logger, in which case, if you look at the outbound properties, you should now see an HTTP status being set of 400. Let's step forward so it goes back to the client. And now if you return to Postman, you should see a 400 bad request coming back to the Postman client. All right. Now what if we want a slightly different type of error? So let's go back to Anypoint Studio again and return to the get delta flights flow inside of here. Now let's delete the transform message processor so that it can't form a valid SOAP envelope inside of our application. We'll delete this out, save it up, and let's try letting the application restart. So once we've saved it, it should attempt to restart. Okay, and now that it's restarted, we'll go back to Postman. And from Postman, we will change our request such that it no longer has the query parameter for foo. So we'll get that out. All right, and we will send this request in and go back to Anypoint Studio. Now in this case, if we move forward, we can see inside of here, once we step over the SOAP request, it throws an exception. If we go down into our exception strategy, we can look at the exception and see it clearly has a different exception type than what we saw before. If we step forward, we'll set the same data, including printing out some information about the exception itself. We can see the SOAP fault about no binding operation info invoking unknown method with parameters unknown. So we're not giving it a valid envelope when sending the request out. And we can step through again. So now if we go back, we can see that the message is printed out with a slightly different error message inside as well. So we'll dive a little bit deeper into these errors, but let's go back to our slides and check out a little bit more about how exception handling works in MMUULLEE.